Phillips call for an ambulance.
They were killed in cold blood.
He did put this out of his mind, and after so much time, he actually believed he got away with it.
When he stepped out, he saw all the cars, all the police officers.
We cannot and we will not forgive you.
The summer of 1957, Elvis Presley's All Shook Up tops the charts, and cruising through the drive-in has become one of America's favorite pastimes. One night, at a little after 11, two teenage couples pull into a secluded lover's lane and engage in another favorite summertime pursuit, necking. An hour later, teenage romance dissolves into sheer terror. A man appears at the car window. In his hand, a gun. Craig Cleary is a detective with the city of El Segundo.
The suspect showed a chrome handgun and basically said, this is a robbery.
The gunman orders the teens to move over. He gets behind the wheel of the car and begins to drive.
When he found a secluded area, he stopped the car, sexually assaulted one of the females.
The rapist orders all four teenagers out of the vehicle, strips them naked, and drives off in their car. The ride, however, is a short one. "5 miles away, a stoplight turns red at the corner of Rosecrans and Sepulveda Boulevards. El Segundo patrolman Milton Curtis and Richard Phillips are sitting in their cruiser when the hijacked car blows through the light.
The vehicle stopped briefly and then proceeded through the red light, at which time our officers made a traffic stop on the suspect.
A few blocks away, 28-year-old patrolman James Gilbert is riding shotgun in a police cruiser.
We were southbound on Sepulveda, and we heard Phillips and Curtis call for a 28 and 29 on a vehicle.
A 28 and 29, a routine check for license and registration.
Turned the corner there, and they had the suspect vehicle pulled over, and Phillips was out talking to the subject, and Curtis was kind of sitting on the passenger side of the vehicle talking on the radio.
With the scene apparently under control, officers Phillips and Curtis wave off the second squad. While driving away, Gilbert takes a long look at the man standing on the side of the road.
Well, I'd made a lot of arrests out of Lawndale and that area over there, and I thought maybe I knew the guy. And I took a good look at him. I didn't recognize him, and so we just went ahead and left.
Unbeknownst to any of the officers at the scene, they are dealing with a desperate character. A man with rape and robbery in his rear view mirror and a .22 caliber pistol in his back pocket.
When Officer Curtis asked for information on the plate, obviously the suspect wasn't the registered owner. There were a lot of the kids' clothing and personal belongings in the vehicle. The suspect probably felt it was just a matter of time before that information would come over the radio and the officers would learn of those crimes.
In a matter of moments, a routine traffic stop goes horribly wrong as the suspect pulls out his gun and begins to use it, shooting Phillips 3 times at point-blank range and Curtis twice in the chest. Officer Phillips falls to the ground, still holding the car radio, and manages to get a call out for help.
We heard Phillips call for an ambulance, so we turned around and went back. And when we got there, Curtis was sprawled across the front seat of the car, and Phillips was kind of on the ground.
Gilbert's partner stays with the mortally wounded officers, while Gilbert himself gives chase. Just a few blocks from the scene, Gilbert spots the getaway car ditched in a residential neighborhood.
Guy came out of the one of the duplexes there and said that The guy that parked that car there just jumped out and ran down between the apartments here.
The foot chase begins. Gilbert races through the neighborhood, hopping fences and searching backyards. Dozens of police units ride every street and back alley. All night they search. All night they find no one. Back at the getaway car, fingerprint expert Howard Speaks begins the search for clues. On the steering wheel, 2 partial prints emerge. Individually, the partial prints are of little use, but when combined, they make up the best piece of evidence in the case.
That night, there was a guy on duty in the sheriff's photo lab that knew something about fingerprints, and he was able to see that there was an area in each one of these latents that looked the same. And he put the two together and made the composite picture.
In conjunction with the fingerprint, a sketch of the suspect is developed from the recollections of Officer Gilbert and the 4 teenagers kidnapped and robbed by the same assailant just minutes before the murders.
They're looking for a male white, 25 to 30, 6 foot to 6'2", anywhere from 190 to 200 pounds, spoke with a southern accent.
Despite thousands of tips and leads, the search for the cop killer is fruitless and frustrating.
Yeah, you can't help but be frustrated when you know you've got a good fingerprint that's identifiable from a homicide scene, and no one has been identified. It's very frustrating.
The case weighs heavily on investigators. The burden, even heavier for 2 young families, left without a husband or father.
I remember I was awakened by crying, and I remember standing in the hallway and her coming in to put me back to bed.
Keith Curtis was 5 years old when a knock at the door brought news of his father's murder and a trip to the morgue.
When we did go to the mortuary, I did get to view my dad, and I got to view Officer Phillips also. And I do remember not understanding why they were there and asking the question, why he was there, and they said he was sleeping.
2 children and a widow survived 25-year-old Milton Curtis. 29-year-old Richard Phillips left behind a wife and 3 children.
My mom had a real hard time talking about my dad. We were just like, well, where's our dad? And, I can't even remember specifically what she even said. I just know that he just wasn't there.
Years pass. The investigation goes cold, and the files are buried in the back of a police cabinet. Until one day when a shovel full of dirt turns up a fresh lead in the form of a .22 caliber revolver. One stop down the line from El Segundo lies Manhattan Beach. In the spring of 1960, local resident Doug Tooley picks up a shovel and rake and ventures into his backyard.
We were digging up the backyard, getting rid of the weeds, and I think my son Bob was using a pickfork and turning over the weeds, and he found a pistol.
More precisely, Doug Tooley's son finds the rusted frame of a .22 caliber revolver. Shortly thereafter, Tooley himself makes a second discovery. This time, it's the cylinder of a .22 caliber revolver, a 9-shot barrel with 6 spent casings and 1 live cartridge.
I didn't know what to do with it, so I called up the police and I said, I found this in the backyard. What should I do with it? Throw it away or bring it down to you or what? And they came right out and took it.
Investigators immediately think of their colleagues, Officers Curtis and Phillips. Shot 6 times with a .22, ballistics confirms their suspicions. The gun found in Tooley's backyard is matched to slugs pulled from the officers' bodies. Now detectives must trace the gun back to its owner, a hunt that takes them 1,600 miles east to the bayou country of Louisiana. Investigators track the murder weapon to a Sears and Roebuck store in Shreveport, Louisiana. The sale is logged to a man by the name of G.D. Wilson. Date of purchase, July 18, 1957. Just 4 days before Officers Phillips and Curtis were killed. Detectives fan out through Shreveport, looking for further traces of G.D. Wilson. They pick up his scent around the corner from Sears at the local YMCA.
There was a George D. Wilson that had checked in to the YMCA the night before the handgun was purchased.
In the YMCA booking log, Wilson lists a permanent address in Miami, Florida. Police run the address down. It turns up fake. With no other alternatives, detectives then decide to track down every George Wilson living in the United States. One by one, each man's fingerprint is compared with the partials left at the crime scene. One by one, each man named Wilson is eliminated. 4 years after 2 officers are killed in the line of duty, every lead has been run and every hope dashed. Mr. Wilson is nowhere to be found and will remain that way for more than 3 decades. The passage of time. For years, it offered aid and comfort to a cop killer. Hidden, the mystery of a case made colder and colder with every tick of the clock. But time is a fickle friend, and now it's on the side of justice.
I always felt that there was a good possibility that this case would be solved. There was just good evidence, good physical evidence.
Lieutenant Craig Cleary begins to work the Curtis and Phillips murders in 1995. In the fall of 2002, Cleary's patience begins to pay dividends.
Our police department received a phone call from a lady who advised us that she felt that she knew who was responsible for the murders of our 2 police officers.
The woman claims her uncle is the killer. L.A. County Sheriff investigators Dan McElderry and Kevin Lowe are tasked to help Cleary work the case.
And we were going to do everything we could to either clear this guy or start building a case against him.
Most of the evidence had been preserved, and a lot of the evidence was boxed up. There were volumes and volumes of documentation on this case.
Among those documents, fingerprint cards yellowed with age and containing 2 latent fingerprints lifted from the steering wheel of the killer's car 45 years earlier.
And at that point, I had Donald Keir from our section do some work with the fingerprint as far as the enhancement and the sharpening of the image that we had.
After 4 decades in storage, the condition of the original prints is less than ideal.
They were falling apart and some of them have already deteriorated. So at that point I saw that I wanted to save what we had.
Using digital imaging software, Keir enhances the 2 partial prints, then merges them to create a single composite.
Those fingerprints were checked against the individual in the lead, and it proved that the fingerprints that we had on the case did not belong to this individual.
With the latest suspect quickly eliminated, investigators are once again holding a decades-old case with no suspects and no leads. In the year 2002, however, one thing is different. The FBI has introduced a national automated fingerprint identification system, also known as AFIS. The composite print is traced into the AFIS system, plotted for points of identification, and then run through the database. In a matter of minutes, AFIS compares the lift against more than 44 million sets of prints.
And there was probably half a dozen of us looking at all the ridge structure that was consistent between the fingerprint that we had as the evidence fingerprint and the fingerprint from the database. And everybody's standing by that screen, looking at the image and saying, "We got him."
Falcon pages 3 detectives to the print lab.
Well, at first I couldn't believe it.
Craig sat down and looked like he was getting a little weak in the knees.
I think we must have asked them over and over several times, "Are you sure?
They thought we were kidding.
How sure are you?" are you positive?
Once he read our faces, he could see that this was not a joke.
The suspect print matches up to a South Carolina man named Gerald Mason. Born in 1934, Mason would have been 23 at the time of the murders. A background check reveals he served time in a South Carolina prison for burglary. His 1956 booking photo is compared to sketches of the suspect.
We blew the photograph up at our crime lab to make it the same size as the composites. We laid it out and we were just blown away. I mean, it was just amazing, the resemblance.
For us, that was huge. Not only did we get a match on these prints, but we have a suspect that is consistent with the physical description that was given to us. 23 years old, 6'2", 200 pounds, from the South. We were fairly confident at this time that we were on the right track.
In 1957, patrol officer James Gilbert rolled up to the fatal traffic stop just moments before the shooting started and got a good look at the suspect. Cold case detectives placed Mason's photo in a lineup and asked Gilbert if, 45 years later, anyone looks familiar. Gilbert points to Mason's photo.
I told them if I'd have seen the son of a bitch, I'd have shot him.
That's a great identification. As far as we're concerned, now we're going forward with this investigation full steam ahead.
Cold case detectives can now put Gerald Mason at the scene of the crime, with his fingerprints on the steering wheel of a stolen car. To make their case, however, investigators must also put the murder weapon in his hand. In 2002, investigators in Southern California got an unexpected break in a 45-year-old case. The murders of on-duty police officers Richard Phillips and Milton Curtis. The FBI's National Fingerprint Database matches fingerprints from the 1957 crime scene to a man named Gerald Mason, a 68-year-old grandfather living in Columbia, South Carolina. The forensic link is strong, but not strong enough for cold case detectives.
Somebody has their prints in a car, maybe that can be explained away. Maybe, he drove the car, maybe he worked on the car, maybe he was at the scene before the officers got there and had gone inside the car to look and accidentally touched the steering wheel. There's things that could be explained. As difficult as it may be, why your prints are in that car, we needed other evidence.
Investigators believe they must tie Gerald Mason to the murder weapon, a 9-shot, .22 caliber revolver found buried in a backyard a few miles from the shooting. In 1960, the gun's serial number was traced to Shreveport, Louisiana. The weapon, purchased at the local Sears and Roebuck by a man ID'd in the gun registry as G.D. Wilson.
At that point, they believed that George D. Wilson was the suspect for this case. In fact, they searched out for every George D. Wilson in the United States.
Just around the corner from the Sears and Roebuck is the local YMCA. On the night before the gun was purchased, a man identified only as George D. Wilson checked in and stayed the night. Cold case detectives pull a photocopy of the YMCA registry cards from the old evidence files.
So now we've got an actual document with his name and his handwriting and his printing on this document.
The document is passed along to handwriting specialist Paul Edholm, along with a sample of handwriting from the suspect, Gerald Mason.
First letter, G. That's probably the letter that I saw the most, and it just jumped off the page at me. I mean, they're almost identical as far as the height, the width, the number of strokes it took to make that letter, the slant. All of those factors together, you go, look at this, I gotcha.
Gerald Mason's G is not the only letter in the alphabet to seal his fate. There is his distinctive S with a flattened out rocker on the bottom, and the overall similarities in letter size and spacing. Taken together, the points of penmanship compel Edholm to only one conclusion.
With a photocopy, I can't say absolutely 100%, but I was 99.9% sure that the person that had written the YMCA document was in fact Gerald Mason.
99.9% is good enough for cold case detectives. They pack their bags and head for South Carolina, where time is running out for a cop killer. Patio Drive, a quiet and comfortable slice of suburbia. Here, among the ordinary people, lives a man with a past. Early one Tuesday morning, that past comes knocking at his door.
When he stepped out, he saw all the cars, all the police officers, and then, of course, us telling him we were from Los Angeles.
He just looked like deer in the headlights.
He says, "You're homicide investigators from where?" I was to Los Angeles County. And he says, "You know what? So I think I need an attorney." We proceeded to tell him a little bit more about the case. You know, this is about the murder of 2 police officers in El Segundo back in 1957. And he looks at us and he says, "You're here for that?"
More than 45 years after his getaway, Gerald Mason is arrested and led away on charges of kidnapping, robbery, rape, and murder. Two months after his arrest, Mason confesses to killing officers Milton Curtis and Richard Phillips. He tells police he cannot put his family through a trial. At sentencing, Mason faces the families of his victims and reads from prepared notes.
"I do not understand why I did this. It is contrary to all I believe in. It does not fit in my life. It is not the person I know. I detest these crimes."
He cried and he said he was sorry. Please fight it in yourself to forgive me, and please don't be bitter. It's like, too late. We cannot and we will not forgive you.
Gerald Mason, your family may be shocked, but my family's been devastated for 46 years.
Keith Curtis likewise remains unmoved by Mason's statement, recognizing the words as hollow reminders of the father he never had, and casting them aside as far too little, far too late.
As far as I was concerned, his apology didn't mean nothing to me. The way I looked at it, he had 45 years to pick up a phone if it bothered him that bad. Here I am, come and get me. He had 45 years to apologize. Never did it. It never ruined his golf game. It never ruined his bowling.
I don't think he feels bad for those people. I think he feels bad for himself that he got caught.
Mason's mea culpa also rings hollow with Judge David Wesley, who slaps the cop killer with a double life sentence, with no chance for parole. For the men and women who wear the badge of the El Segundo Police Department, the verdict is gratifying, and the case itself personal, a matter of honor and a matter of family.
They're fellow police officers, and I never obviously met them or knew them, but it's a family here with the El Segundo Police Department. They were part of my family.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the team that solved the murder and brought the criminal to justice.
And it's extremely, extremely gratifying. All cases where you can bring somebody to justice, I mean, that's what we do, and that's what it's about.
We found our guy. However, there's another twist to it.
Both of the DNA profiles were identical to each other.
The problem now is we have to eliminate his brother.
Dawn breaks over the Gulf of Mexico. A new year begins, and the body count stands at 0. No fresh homicides to investigate, no hint of tragedy. That is, until the first call comes in.
We get a call from our dispatch that a potential homicide case had been found.
Corporal Walt Jakes heads to the address an apartment complex on Roosevelt Boulevard, Unit 5653. And the New Year's first murder scene.
She was on the floor in the bedroom. She was nude from the waist down.
She is 23-year-old Lorie Colanino, a college student and cocktail waitress, found dead inside her own apartment.
Inside, her purse was found in the kitchen area, so it didn't look like robbery as far as somebody trying to take her purse or valuables. TVs, stereos, jewelry in the bedroom was still present. It seemed, for all and purposes, that this was a sexual assault of some type that had gone bad.
The county medical examiner arrives on scene, examines the body, and records her initial impressions.
And then there is a group of 15 stab wounds.
The wounds are numerous and deep, providing a bit of insight into the ferocity of the attack.
To stab that deeply that many times, there was a tremendous amount of force being used by this person, which to me shows a high level of anger. He was very motivated to kill her. This was not just stab and run out of the apartment. This was stab and stab and stab to make sure that she was dead.
A technical team processes the scene for prints and uses a laser light to search for bodily fluids, but turns up nothing. Meanwhile, homicide detective Patricia Jewell begins to unravel the last moments of Lorie Colanino's life. Jewell's first priority: interview a man who claims he was actually talking to Colanino on the phone when she was attacked.
She had called him, and they were talking, and then he heard her gasp or scream, and the phone went dead. So then he called her back, and she didn't answer right away. He got her recording.
Hi, this is Lorie. I can't come to the phone right now. If you'd like, leave a message with the beep, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Lorie, are you home? Call me at work when you get a chance. I go in at 4. I'll be here until then. See ya. I just want to make sure you're okay. I just worried.
And he told me that she did pick up, and he asked her if she was okay. And she said yes, and he asked her several times if she was okay, and she said yes, I'll call you back, and hung up.
The friend tells Jewell he waited for Lorie's call, but it never came. Fearing the worst, he headed over to Lorie's apartment, only to find her body.
This was a crime that somebody wanted her, and they went and took her and killed her.
Colanino's body is autopsied the following morning. Semen samples are taken from the body, and the theory of a sexual assault turned murder begins to gain some traction.
My gut, it was somebody that watched her and wanted her, and she might have told him, hey, don't bother me. I did not feel at that time that it was somebody that just walked in off the street.
The semen is tested for DNA, and a profile is developed. Jewell compares the genetic markers against samples collected from a roster of potential suspects. The list includes Lorie Colanino's friends, co-workers, and most especially a jilted ex-boyfriend.
She had a prior friend who she thought was causing her problems. She had to hang up telephone calls. She had vandalism being done to her vehicle.
The ex provides Jewell with a solid alibi. Even better for him, his blood is not a match for the unknown profile. One by one, the rest of the people in Colanino's life, including the friend who found her dead, are tested and eliminated. The pool of suspects grows shallow. No new leads develop, and the case grows cold. Four years after Lorie Colanino was found stabbed to death inside her apartment, homicide detective Mike Ring picks up the old file and begins to read. The more he reads, the more he wonders if perhaps the Colanino murder might not be worth a second look.
We thought it had a potential to be solved mainly because of the amount of physical evidence in terms of the semen and the fact that DNA technology was progressing.
Detective Jim Bining and Corporal John Quinlan pick up the case and quickly identify a starting point. The apartment complex the victim lived in, containing more than 50 buildings and some 500 tenants.
Our plan was to go back to the apartment complex and meet with the manager, and they were very cooperative, and go back through the old lease agreements. And she was able to print out everybody that lived in the complex at that time. We would start with her building, knocking on doors, one by one, meeting with whoever had lived there, finding any male subjects, and requesting a blood sample from them.
There's quite a bit of sales pitch that you have to give to somebody to do an intrusive procedure as far as taking their blood, especially with the atmosphere at that time with O.J. Simpson. People were somewhat skeptical of DNA, police.
Detectives counter cynicism with the charm of a beautiful young woman. Lorie Colanino's life story helps persuade potential suspects to roll up their sleeves.
Lorie was fun, energetic, the life of the party. She had an amazing amount of friends that just loved her. And I would basically try to sell Lorie to whoever was talking to us.
More than 150 men stretch out their arms for the blood draw. Each test result is the same: negative. After months, Quinlan and Bining have tested nearly every male in the sprawling complex, with one exception: the tenant in apartment 4453.
When I got to that apartment, I knocked on the door and didn't receive any answer. I left a card on the door to call me, tape it right to the door. I carry a roll of tape, and I tape my cards to the door. They don't blow off that way. Got no response. Went back other times, same thing, knock on the door, put a card on the door, no response.
The man in 4453 is Brian Calzacorto. His apartment building sits 100 yards from the victim's. His window has a clear view of her door. And his lack of cooperation piques the suspicions of cold case detective Jim Bining.
What I did then is caused me to start doing a little bit of a background check on him, and started inquiring about the Calzacorto family, and found that he had been a suspect in a homicide to his father in Pennsylvania.
With a hint of murder in his past, Brian Calzacorto jumps to the top of the suspect list. The next time cold case detectives pay apartment 4453 a visit, they find Calzacorto has pulled up stakes and taken it on the lam. Calzacorto's father was found shot to death inside the family home. Pennsylvania State Police investigated the case at the time, questioning family members about Brian Calzacorto and getting nowhere.
There was court proceedings against the family in Pennsylvania, at which time they pled the Fifth Amendment over 130 times, I believe it was.
No charges were ever filed against Calzacorto. Now he is again linked to a murder, and for the second time makes an unexpected exit.
His brother reports him missing, which we find kind of strange. I mean, he's lived there for 4 years now. All of a sudden, we're knocking on his door and he's missing.
Well, we can't find him. We don't know where he is. Eventually, the apartment complex considers his apartment abandoned, and they ended up taking custody of all his property because he had not paid his rent, left his car. His car had been repossessed, I think, actually. So he's nowhere to be found.
Brian Calzacorto is now more than a person of interest in the death of Lorie Colanino. He's at the top of the suspect list. It's not long before investigators meet him face to face. Brian Calzacorto resurfaces at the beach, hanging out among the tourists, looking to lift a wallet or stray purse.
He'd been caught stealing purses and things off of people who were in the water while they're at the beach. He's stealing stuff off the blankets. So he gets arrested.
Cold case detectives catch wind of the arrest and head to Pinellas County Jail, where they brace Calzacorto about the murder of Lorie Colanino. Calzacorto claims he heard of the killing but knows nothing further.
So at that point, I hit him with, hey, we can eliminate you from this case. I want blood samples and saliva sample. At which time he says, I need to talk to an attorney.
Calzacorto lawyers up and refuses to give a DNA sample. With nothing directly tying the suspect to Colanino's murder, investigators don't have probable cause to compel a blood sample. Once again, the investigation gets shelved in a closet full of cold cases where it will sit and wait. Five years after he first came across police radar, Brian Calzacorto lives across the bay in Tampa, Florida. Cold case detectives have kept a close eye on their suspect, and thus far have kept their distance.
We knew we couldn't approach him directly. He'd already refused, and we didn't want him knowing at this point that he was under investigation again, because nobody had talked to him, nobody had spoken to him, nobody had approached him in basically 5 years.
Detectives need only one thing to eliminate Calzacorto as a suspect or to charge him with murder. They need his DNA. Investigators decide to go undercover to get it.
We know we can get evidence out of people's trash. So we decide at that point the next easiest way to get some kind of sample of Brian's DNA is to do a trash pull.
And the trash pull consists basically of undercover officers staking out the apartment and waiting for the suspect to dump his trash. And once you dump the trash, it becomes pretty much public domain. They have no control over it. The detectives would go in, pick up the trash, bring it back, and then we'd go through it and see what was in it that would be of use for DNA analysis.
After several nights of babysitting Calzacorto's garbage, investigators get lucky. Forensic tech Tanya Wold.
We collected some Q-tips. I believe there was some hairs in there, cigarette butts, beer bottles. These items might have any trace of skin, blood, anything that we might be able to pull the DNA off of.
At the State Forensic Lab, Melissa Sudeth examines the items and chooses several for DNA testing.
From the cigarette butt, I just took a cutting from the filter end of the cigarette butt and extracted the DNA from that. And I swabbed the material from the electric razor screen and then took that swabbing and extracted the DNA from that material, which looked like it could potentially be skin cells.
The items provide Sudeth with a DNA sample. She compares it with the DNA found at Lorie Colanino's murder scene.
And that DNA profile did in fact match the DNA profile that was obtained from the semen stains on the vaginal swabs and the pubic hair samples.
She was very, very excited, told us that she had made a match between, the stuff we pulled from Brian and the semen that was left at the scene.
No doubt.
A 100% DNA match. Conclusive evidence that Brian Calzacorto raped and killed Lorie Colanino. Or so it would seem.
We found our guy. However, there's another twist to it.
The twist comes when cold case detectives discover their suspect has a twin named Alfred. He too lives in Tampa, and if he is an identical twin, has the exact same DNA markers as his brother Brian.
The problem now is we have to eliminate his brother. And that's the crux of this whole case, is Alfred Calzacorto a identical twin or a fraternal twin? We didn't know for sure.
Once again, cold case detectives go underground. Once again, they sit in their cars outside a dumpster and wait. This time, however, it is Alfred Calzacorto's garbage they are waiting on.
Decided that we would do another trash pull, and this time do a trash pull on Alfred's trash.
We pulled out a toothbrush, some other items, sent them off to FDLE.
And both of the DNA profiles were identical to each other. So the DNA profile identified as being from Alfred Calzacorto was exactly the same as the DNA profile for Brian Calzacorto.
It's a first for Clearwater detectives. Two men conclusively matched the semen found at a crime scene. Investigators must now consider the possibility that Alfred Calzacorto is their killer.
How do we prove that it's Brian and not Alfred? And some of the things we look at is, well, who lives in close proximity to the victim? Who had access to the apartment complex on the day of the murder? Who was at work? Who wasn't?
Brian Calzacorto has no alibi for the afternoon Colanino was killed. His twin Alfred, on the other hand, says he was working. His boss at the time, Susan Schindewolf, attests to such.
He was at work that day, and he did not take an extended lunch hour. When they explained, where everything happened, there was no way he could have left our office in downtown Tampa, driven to Clearwater, committed this act, cleaned himself up or whatever, driven back to work within an hour's time. It's impossible.
Investigators get in a car and time the trip for themselves.
We did the mileage checks from where Alfred worked and where Alfred lived to the apartment complex. And we basically demonstrated through time and distance that Alfred couldn't have done it if he was at work. He couldn't have gotten over to Pinellas County from Tampa, the 20-plus miles, in the time frame allotted for the murder.
While the physical evidence points to both brothers as possible suspects, all circumstantial evidence points to only one brother.
Brian was the one that was in trouble for theft and other things. Brian was the suspect in his dad's murder. Brian lived in the apartment complex. Alfred didn't. Everything in our investigation, even though there was identical DNA, everything for us focused on Brian.
In the spring of 2001, Brian Calzacorto is arrested and charged with the murder of Lorie Colanino. Courtroom number 7, the 4th floor on the Pinellas County Courthouse. Here, Brian Calzacorto faces a judge and jury. After 5 days of trial and 6 hours of deliberation, Calzacorto is found guilty of murder in the 1st degree and pulls a term of life in prison.
It's great gratification. However, we do it for the family. They're the ones that have sat for 11 years with no justice. It would have been real easy to throw it down and say, we ain't gonna be able to solve this. Persistence, it pays off.